architecture, parametric landscape. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I read it. With co-author Andrew Cudless, and you also did a introduction for another book,
Drawing codes.
Drawing Codes, which is extremely complex and again, way above my pay grade. So Dr. Isla's a PhD also, so I should have introduced her as Dr. Isla Berman, but Dr. Mona El Khafif is an associate professor of architecture and urban environmental planning and serves as the graduate urban design program director. Her interdisciplinary research explores urban design, temporary urbanism, smart environments, and urban prototyping across scales. Her work has been widely exhibited and supported through international collaborations, grants, and academic leadership roles. At UVA, Mona serves as the RCN director of the recently funded National Science Foundation grant entitled Main Street 21, supporting a network of small and mid-scale cities in Virginia, and co-directs the school's initiative on smart environments. Mona started her academic career in 2000, when she was 12, in Vienna, Austria, at the Institute for Urban Design and Landscape Architecture, taught at Tulane University, and worked in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina on rehabilitation of neighborhoods there. Also at the California College of Arts in San Francisco, the University of Waterloo in Canada, and recently a visiting professor at the University of Toronto School of Architecture. This fall, Mona received the ACSA Creative Achievement Award for the Biophilic Region Project. And you guys are going to hear about biophilia in a few moments. And as if they didn't have enough to do, Isla and Mona are principals in Scale Shift, a design research firm based in Toronto and Charlottesville. The design practices resulted in numerous temporary urban art interventions and exhibitions, including projects such as 10 by 10 Cities, the Green Facts Challenge, and other things. And if you'd like to learn more about them, they're all over the website. You can find them on the UVA website. And that's it. Now I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to you guys.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. I'm Isla, this is Mona. We're going to talk today about site analysis, site research, drawing cities and territories, and we're going to do it through 4 projects, 2 that are cities, New York and Vienna, and 2 that are larger territories, the Salton Sea and the Biophilic Region.
Hi, everyone. I'm also excited to be here. So we will start with New York. The city we want to speak about in terms of site research and analysis is New York City. This is a city that one of our core graduate design studios was focused on for many years, and where Isla and I both coordinated studios. Part of this work is published in this beautiful book called Next New York, a part of the Next City series, and we are happy to leave 1 copy here for your library. The focus of these studios was the design of large urban buildings, often mixed use, that were large enough to constitute a piece of the city, and that would often occupy an entire block or be used to infill a block. This is an example of one of our former students, and I think Dave is very familiar both with the project as well as the student, since after seeing his work, he hired the student for his architectural practice. A main emphasis of these studios was to integrate housing and other urban programs while focusing on designing for affordability. Often we chose sites that represented city-owned land because this would ensure that the city has a greater leverage in partnerships with developers, which was very often a part of the design assignment. and to generate, hopefully, new precedents for affordable housing. The first assignment in our New York studios was usually the analysis of the city and its boroughs. We focused on multiple topics of analysis that we used as lenses through which to read the city. These included, for example, transit and mobility, historic transformation, land and real estate dynamics, landscape ecologies, urban morphologies, urban programming, and demographics, among others. Students worked on these topics in teams that crossed studio sections. This ensured that different students were studying distinct research areas in relation to the site that later would serve as a shared resource among the different cohorts. This research also included different methods for representation, from mapping to cartographies to diagrams, datascapes, and different methods of modeling that we asked students to operate across scales. In this process, students not only worked with multiple forms of drawing and representation, but also invented new forms. And, it was really nice when they started to put physical models on the maps to give this exercise a little bit more of experimentation. At the top of this image here, you can see the analysis of one of our students who investigated the fabric of Manhattan. They generated an inventory of the typical Manhattan long block in relationship to porosity, density, parcelization, access to light, and building topology in order to make an argument to favor pedestrian cross-circulation through the blocks, which we know Jane Jacobs would have really loved. The block is one of the smallest urban units. This makes it the interface between urban and architecture. The focus on urban buildings at the scale of the city therefore asks students to think about what their future design projects can contribute to the city, also in form of public spaces, etc. After the urban analysis and site research, we started the design process, what you can see at the bottom, with students generating iterative massing strategies for their projects, underscoring the development of new urban typologies.
So in later versions of the New York studio, we moved across the river. We wanted to work on sites that were outside of Manhattan in Brooklyn. So in this particular project, we were working in the Brooklyn Navy Yards, which is the area in the circle in the center. And to understand the city and its 5 boroughs in relation to the fluid boundaries, like the East River, that links Manhattan to Brooklyn. And this is a mapping that was focused on transit systems and mobility. We studied the infrastructural systems like the subway, vehicular and bus routes that cross the river and stitch these territories together. It also mapped ferry and boat infrastructure that's becoming more critical for New York, for the city, in particular in relation to our site, because our site was an industrial site that was being regenerated. It had always been linked to the water because of transporting goods in and out of the site, but it wasn't linked at all to the pedestrian subway network. So this mapping also focused on highlighting, you see the series of circles that are highlighting portions of the map, and that was based on determining walking radii from the stations, the various stations, and stops to understand what territories were being served by these systems. And in this studio, students and in the site research, they looked at 2 very distinct scales, moving from the scale of the city to the scale of the neighborhood and to the block. And they were analyzing urban flows, mobility, and access. And they used, of course, different strategies at these different scales. At the local site scale, they were specifically focused on the context of not of the systems, but of different paths to the site, depending on the system of transit that somebody might take. And they were also interested in the differences in travel time, depending on the route, but also the kind of character of the neighborhoods that they were moving through, and that was shown in these series of drawings. So these are the 3 different sites, and we had journey maps that were representing these neighborhoods. In studying things like the histories of the sites, students looked at both natural and cultural histories. And these are summarized in this image in two timelines, one that's running along the bottom horizontally, that corresponds to the transformation of our site from what was once a watery marshland into the built piers of its shipping history. And the other that's shown vertically along the right-hand side that refers to significant dates when major urban transformations were occurring. The mapping in the center reveals the urban morphology of the territory, identifying our three sites, where the three sites located in red in the Brooklyn Navy Yards, as well as things like topography showing the potential of flood inundation. And then when we zoomed in to each of the three local sites represented by these three bands, the mapping is overlaid with a collage for each of the sites, revealing both, in a way, the specific character and history of the sites using images in combination with sections that expose their differing urban topographies. This particular mapping, also in relation to the Brooklyn Navy Yards, was focused on land use, demographic data, population densities, and also median incomes of particular neighborhoods. And in this, it was also looking at things like places of culture, libraries, museums, theaters, galleries, as well as schools and places of worship. And this mapping was color-coded so that blue was representing residential neighborhoods, maroon was representing business and industries, to reveal what was referred to as a work-life gradient, so you could understand where these mixtures were occurring on the map, et cetera. And then when we moved into the local site scale, the same color-coded strategy gets used, except that it's now much more fine-grained, more refined, referring to distinctions at the scale of the building or the lot. And within our site, encoding was also used to reference the range of different types of industries that were actually existing, located at the Navy Yard, combining data and photographic information, and that's what you sort of see along the bottom and along the left-hand side. And this is a more detailed understanding of the existing small-scale manufacturing on the site, which was important for us given that our program was about housing hybridized with vertical manufacturing and creative design industries. In a different New York studio that I ran, where we had three sites that straddled the East River, rather than simply focusing on land, we actually centered the river in the middle of the drawings of the larger sites so that this would become the emphasis. And in this particular series of mappings and other drawings, we combined landscape and urban topography to show the relationship between built urban topography, meaning the artificial landscape that's literally created by the buildings themselves, and the topography of the ground, seeing them as one kind of continuum. And then we continued this topography into the bathymetry of the river, which is the literal topography underwater of the river. We often think about rivers and water as just being this flat surface, right? But it's a continuous topography. And this was about revealing the floodplain to which we were responding in the studio. So you see the entire area that was blue around, which is on land, but that's representing the floodplain because it's revealing to us the kind of fragility of our site. And this mapping also showed, you see in green, all of the kind of public green spaces within the neighborhood of our site. And these drawings, this is zooming in to the three local sites. It also included timelines of what had been built in these areas throughout its history, as well as sections of the site, all of which cut through the river. And as I said, what was exposed in these drawings was this condition, not of the separation of land and water, but how this was a continuous system. And as I said before, the kind of fragility of our sites in relation to the water's edge, because we learned through this process that they were all threatened by inundation. And that was because our existing site had previously occupied a marshland territory, so it wasn't surprising. The last set of research drawings of New York that we'll show today is this series This was also looking at program, the ways in which the site was zoned and used. And in this case, the urban analysis was based on rethinking zoning and land use through an understanding of a kind of tripartite relationship between places where we live, places where we work, and places that are visited by tourists and other temporary visitors. And this provided a kind of interesting lens through which to re-see the city and foregrounded the ideas that there are multiple ways in which a city can be read. And most often we're trying to combine these in a series of drawings. And this work, live, visit kind of classification strategy that we used was also a lens that was used at the local site and neighborhood scale. But here it's to understand more specifically the composition of neighborhoods through this finer grain. And mappings of these areas in plan were combined with datascapes that expose the specific quantitative mixtures of different programs that might be happening within and across blocks or within neighborhoods, and the ways in which these are linked to urban morphology.
Okay, so I'm going to bring you, we are flying across the Atlantic. We are going to bring you to Vienna. That's a city where Ayla and I taught last semester, a research studio for our 24 grad and undergrad students. And the title of the studio was Fringe Territories, Designing Vienna's Exopolis. So Vienna is, according to many official statistics, one of the most livable cities in the world. And when we think of Vienna, and David already mentioned, a city that I had a pleasure to live and work in for 10 years before I moved to the United States, we often think about the beautiful historic fabric, classical music, and amazing cafe houses, and really good coffees and cake for sure. But what we often forget is that Vienna is also a city with likely the best policies set in place to support state-funded housing. Municipal housing in Vienna emerged from the pressures of rapid industrialization before 1918, when overcrowding and severe housing shortages fueled reform movements. The most transformative phase occurred during what we call the Red Vienna from 1919 to 1934, when the socialist city government launched an unprecedented public housing campaign, constructing approximately 60,000 flats, financed through progressive tax of luxury goods, rents, and land speculation, producing landmark projects like the Karl-Marx-Hof and the Roymannhof. And for everyone who wasn't in Vienna yet, the Karl-Marx-Hof is a building that is 1 kilometer long and was not only a housing project, but it was an employment program. The people who worked on it very often moved in later on, and it was infused with social infrastructure. After the war in 1945, the city resumed large-scale municipal construction and established Wiener Wohnen, or what we call the Viennese housing, to manage and expand the housing stock. From the late 20th century to today, Vienna has shifted towards a mixed model, combining publicly funded municipal housing with limited profit development, emphasizing rehabilitation, environmental performance, and social cohesion, while maintaining affordability through rent regulation, corporate financing, and supportive zoning policies. We visited the subsidized and affordable housing stock while in Vienna. These pictures are just a sampling to highlight the architectural quality of these buildings, all generated through competitions and following the principles of combining housing with social infrastructure as a contribution to the public realm. Vienna also has an extremely successful history on public transit, which started during the time of Otto Wagner and the Viennese secessionists. Vienna has also, where they invested into what was called at this time the Stadtbahn, and then was continued as the metro infrastructure to ensure rapid access to specifically the fringe today. In particular, to territories planned for urban development in the 21st and 22nd districts on the other side of the Danube, And again, what is so beautiful about that infrastructure is that it was it's designed, it's important to mention that, by architects and urban designers, but it is also very often coupled with cultural, social, and commercial programs. When we visited, the city really surprised us with many projects that we can describe as typological innovations. What you see here on these images is the very affordable youth hostel where we stayed while we were in Vienna, and that was designed by Querkraft architects. This is a design that combined the first inner city IKEA without parking on site with an affordable youth hostel. The project also includes publicly accessible rooftop terraces that are used for flea markets and other social events located only 1 minute from the city's west train station and metro stations, providing an excellent transit to connections. Though historically dominated through an inner city core, which is the first district, and as a system of rings, Vienna today directs its growth through a polycentric development as described in the STEP, its urban development plan. Connected through public transit and mixed-use developments, these new urban subcenters generate high-density urban cores, places to live and work, supporting the city as a whole. Here you can see some of these centers with contemporary architecture, like the Donau City, where the UN is located, or the Vienna University of Business and Economics, very close to the Prater. One of these sub-centers, the Seestadt Aspern, or in English, the Lake City Aspern, which is the location of our site where we work with our students, is a former airfield on the fringes of Vienna that has over the last 20 years transformed into one of the largest urban development projects in Northern Europe. Connected by the U2 metro line, Aspern is roughly the size of Vienna's historic inner district and can be reached by public transit in approximately 30 minutes. Notably, the subway infrastructure was built before the development began. Upon arrival at the lake, residents and visitors encounter a large car-free new urban city center offering high-quality housing, cultural institutions, office spaces, and diverse workplaces. Our studio focused on the 3 sites, and you can see them here highlighted in the different circles.
That's just in the upper right-hand side.
Sorry, on the upper right-hand side. And they are all in proximity to the subway station, asking our students to develop a sustainable model for dense urban expansion as a fringe of the city. And one of the sites, the southern one, where you see this gigantic warehouse, that is actually a former car factory that they are transforming. And we ask our students to work with the existing building stock. The development company that guides the growth in Aspern organizes competitions to implement this development, 1 block at a time. And a large-scale model that we also visited when we went to the information center serves as a reference tool. And Aspern is today one of the prime precedents for sustainable urban development in Europe, which means when we were there were a lot of groups coming from different places in Europe to see their development because it's serving as a really fantastic precedent. We are now switching over to the analysis that we asked our students to work on, and I hope that I can make that video work in a second. Yes, so now I lost my text. So when we worked on the analysis, we on the one hand side wanted our students to get familiar with the city, and we asked them to work at multiple scales, the city as a whole or the site in itself. But we also compiled something that we call a neighborhood atlas, which we identified as a pedagogical tool that can be shared among all students. And what you see here is a fast run of a neighborhood atlas that I worked on a year ago, was in Red Hook actually, and Dave saw that in one of the presentations. I was quite excited. When we worked in Vienna, we aggregated something similar, and the idea here was that it was printed out and it was on everyone's desk so that students could always walk back and forth between a shared resource of analysis and during the design process. So before, and what was also critical, before we created design team, students signed up for an analytical lens that ranged from transit and mobility to urban morphology, ecological system, demographic, land use, renewable energy, etc. And we are doing this on a regular basis, that we first mix the students when they work on the analysis before they create design teams, so that there's always an expertise that comes together later on in the design teams. So we want to give you a very quick overview of some of these projects that we worked on, or the analysis. As featured here, I'm talking once more about the transit analysis. We asked students to work at multiple scales, the city as a whole and the site in specific. The transit analysis shed light on the dominant layers: metro for sure, Stadtbahn, bus routes, pedestrian and bike lanes, road networks. And as you can see in the bar diagram, students also discovered that Vienna, even in comparison to other Austrian cities, favors public transit, pedestrian traffic, and biking over car travel. And already 30 years ago, they modeled the first car-free neighborhood where people could choose to live without a car, but had more open space in comparison or in exchange for that. In addition to the network analysis showing that the city provides access through a well-deployed system of transit infrastructure, we asked our students to look at the history of infrastructural systems in the city. And you can see this at the bottom of this drawing. The map above shows how the investment also in this infrastructure guided and enabled urban development. And above, at the very top of the slide, you can see a highly local analysis, which is something that we call journey maps, where we put people into from one and that have to travel from one place to another, for example, from the metro station to the school, and they are traveling through the site. And from this perspective, you can understand what the people perspective is, and also where boundary conditions are occurring that you can then address during the design process. The next area of research, we looked at the urban morphology to understand the patterns of the city and its settlement patterns, focusing specifically how these patterns transformed over time and comparing inner city neighborhoods with the fringe. We started with an analysis of the city growth over time, from the historic ring city to a polycentric city that connects its subcenters with public transit infrastructures. Following this model, Vienna has today a very dense fringe, specifically in comparison to maybe US cities. This is supporting its sustainability goals, but also is very understandable because Vienna is a city-state and tries to maintain its green buffer territories and agricultural fields, requiring the city to continuously work towards infill strategies, which are gray fields within the city of unused inner city spaces, as well as very dense urban development at the edge of the city. To develop a better understanding of the city's fabric, we asked the students to sample different multi-block territories across the urban landscape and to compare these samples in relationship to density, morphology, and settlement patterns. This is a slide that wasn't done by our students, but by students from the TU in Vienna, that was published in Arch Plus, showing a timeline of municipal housing projects and their distance to the city center. Over the last 100 years, Vienna tried to place these projects in close proximity to the core. And even today, the city is still using its infill sites to place these projects. And what you maybe can't see on the map on this timeline, but if you would map this out, you would see that these projects are also completely distributed across the city. They are not concentrating in specific areas, and living in a municipal housing has a very good reputation. Everyone wants to live there because they have rent protection and usually very high quality of architectural projects. Here you can see the timeline developed by our students relating housing development to historic events and political frameworks. You can also see at the graph at the bottom that population has been increasing over time to reach what was once Vienna's highest population density that occurred over a century ago as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And that population density had subsequently diminished given Vienna's position adjacent to the Eastern Europe. But after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989 and the expansion of the European Union eastwards, Vienna was repositioned from being an Eastern edge city to become much more centralized within Europe. And this is triggering the growth today, also specifically through migration from the east to the west. And Vienna is hitting a high peak of population growth these days. At the top of this image and linked to the timeline with a number code, you can also see the inventory of Vienna's housing projects, featuring the most important housing projects that had been developed over the last 100 years. And each of these housing projects is featured through a little data set, which included the morphology, the typology, footprint, unit density, and an identification noting if this is municipal housing, nonprofit, or private development. And as students started to work on their own design projects, this was a very helpful list of precedents that they could learn from.
So in addition, of course, we investigated the landscape, the ecology, and the climate of Vienna and our sites, the green and the green territories of the city and the region. And what this revealed, and you're seeing the Danube and Vienna in the center, but Vienna is surrounded by a very important green belt around the city that had historically restricted its lateral growth. And the green belt is constituted by the Vienna forest, or what's known as the Wienerwald, which is in the mountains to the west, and the UNESCO bioreserve of the Lebau to the east, which is basically part of what was the old Danube, the Danube River. Our site, which is because it's located in the outer fringes of Vienna, basically intersected or was right at the edge of this critical greenbelt zone. And this mapping also revealed local green spaces in the city, like parks, et cetera, so that you get a sense of these. But up at the top, it sort of shows them specifically, and many of them were linked to old historic sites, palaces, the Belvedere, et cetera. This research topic also included mapping and understanding the agricultural zones across the city while distinguishing their different typologies and scales of impact, the difference between greenhouse, crops, vineyards, et cetera. And Vienna, as with many cities, emerged in relation to a river, in this case, the Danube River, that bisects through the city. And it was therefore important for us to understand the history of hydrological development of the city, which is also a story of controlling and channelizing the complex multitude of river tributaries constituting what is called the Danube floodplain, that you can see in this sort of series of drawings, right? That the river starts out being this incredibly complex thing that eventually gets channelized, right, by artificial hydrological systems, major canals, dams, water infrastructure, which is all about preventing flooding while also providing recreational territories for the city. In the analysis of landscape and ecology, it took many forms. In addition to planimetric cartographies, it was also explored through a series of sections and datascapes to help us understand the mountainous terrain and the topography of the environment around the city and the relationship of that topography to the urban realm, the river and the wetlands. So this is a series of serial sections. In the section is an image of that slice, right, of that ground. At the bottom of the section is a datascape, and you can also see where it's running through the river. These are the mountains to the west. And students also looked at and classified and looked at the data around many natural ecologies. In the demographic analysis of the city, it was focused on understanding the city's organization and identity. And this, when we think about the identity of the city, it's always difficult to understand this from the outside. So it was revealed in this mapping in many different ways. And this particular mapping was about understanding both the characteristics of the population, things like economic and education level, for example, and the cultural identities, perhaps, and diversity of those that live there. But it also focused on how these conditions might translate into the character of a place or a neighborhood. And this is, as I said, something that's very difficult to apprehend. So to help in this process, the studio drew from what were crowdsourced data and user-generated hood maps like this, that sort of tell you something about the place, like the way in which the people who live there understand it, right? And these are more closely aligned with the neighborhood character than what was traditionally, or what might be traditionally understood if you just looked at demographic data. These mappings on demographic analysis are spatialized mappings that are also datascapes. They are showing the relationship between the pairing of different mapped data sets. So for example, the upper image on the upper left is a comparison of income levels, where darker means higher income, in relationship to the location of green spaces in the city, exposing that the green park space is relatively evenly distributed. It's not only in the places where the rich are living, et cetera. And the large data mapping on the right shows the distribution of municipal public housing in yellow in relation to differing housing sizes per district. And here you can see what's really dark obviously means larger household size, or perhaps larger families, et cetera. But again, what we noticed from the mapping is that the public housing or subsidized housing, and I should say that 60% of Viennese live in subsidized housing. So it doesn't have there's not a stigma around social housing. This is, most of the middle class of the population live in subsidized housing. But it also shows that the publicly funded housing projects are evenly distributed across the city and not concentrated in particular neighborhoods, as they often are here. And this demographic and identity analysis also moved across multiple scales. So on the one hand, it worked to understand the constitution of Vienna's districts. It has 22 districts. The first district is the historic center. We were working in the 22nd district, right, at the fringes. And you see a sort of sampling of these on the far left. So those were 4 of the districts, and we were looking at data in relation to that. And on the other hand, we also tried to zoom in to understand the character of particular neighborhoods. The 3 highlighted circles, for example, clarified that our site in Aspern, which Mona showed in an earlier map, the one on the bottom, was the same size as what was the historic center of Vienna. And the bands to the right of the circles they don't just show planimetric information, they include sections that show the urban heights and density of each of the districts, as well as collages that were about revealing the character of the neighborhood. So you can see the difference between the experience of what might be the historic district versus the contemporary nature of our district. And of course, this was done not just through images of buildings, sectional information, but also through the imagined stories and thoughts of somebody who might be living there, to understand who are the characters as kind of actors, who are the people that we're designing for. So one of the key components of this analysis was also to understand the polycentricity of the city that Mona had talked about earlier, because the city isn't limited to one core. It's not just about its historic district, but also by other centers that are attractors for the city, but that might be attractors in relation to different programs. So things like the Vienna University campus, the attractor is education. It's an education center. Donau City, which is high-rise, it's an office and business center for the city. The Belvedere quarter around the new main train station is a live-work development. So this helped us understand not only the relationship of our own site to these other centers, because on that map you can see Ashburn is out there. These are the territories that we're looking at. But it was also about us thinking about what the character was for the place that we were actually designing. What was going to be the attractor to that lake city? The lake, of course, was, of course, one of the attractors. So site models were also a really important part, not just of representing the site or being used at the final stages, but as a way of understanding the site as a key part of our site research. So we developed site models at 3 different scales: the scale of the city, which is at the top, the scale of the sort of neighborhoods, and the scale of the site. So we had 3 sites. We had 3 models for the site, one that showed all 3 sites in relationship to each other. And the methods of modeling were about making clear distinctions between what might be built, what was agricultural land, what were ecological territories, while also revealing the patterns and densities of development. It's a little hard to see from this images, but when you see the sort of grain, the places that were built were actually 3D printed and showed the actual fabric. At the bottom, you can see the kind of bioreserve of the Lobau territory around the Danube River and the agricultural territories. Students worked with these models, so they weren't just about site research, they were also the working models that we used throughout the semester, scaling up as their projects developed so that their final project models, and these are some examples of our studio's final models, that could be embedded within these initial models. And these are 3 different final projects on the 3 different sites that we had. So you see the sort of difference between them. And it was not only about modeling the site and understanding the site, but it was also about the students' responses to it. And one of the critical aspects of our approach was to ensure that in the methods of modeling, we wanted to ensure that the ways in which we were representing the landscape was equal to the degree to which we often model architecture and urban built space. And you can see this very much in this particular model by 2 students. Our students worked in teams of 2, where the building, and this was the factory building, was their site that they took on. But you can see that they developed the entire landscape, of course, as well, and modeling that landscape was key. The importance of the modeling strategies also enabled us to compare different urban architectural and landscape approaches to a single site. This is shown in these 3. These are 3 different schemes for the same site. For the Heidjokel site, which was one of our 3 sites in Ashburn, that was more linked to agricultural territories, and the integration of agriculture and in many different ways was taken on by all 3 projects. Many of the students were looking at a kind of model of agro or eco urbanism. The third project that we're going to share today is based on a recent studio I led called A Future Terropolis, Speculative Urban Landscapes for the Salton Sea in California, which focused on the relationship of architecture and urbanism to the thickened material landscape and investigated a kind of dispersed landscape urbanism. It was a lot about a lot of landscape, a little amount of built space, but it was also an enormous site, probably the largest site I've ever taken on in a studio. So our site was the Salton Sea, which is a shallow, landlocked, highly saline body of water. It's 15 miles wide by 35 miles long. It's situated 236 feet below sea level. It's situated in a desert and mountainous landscape that is in the Imperial Valley in California at the southern end of the state of California, just north of the border of Mexico. It's 2 hours drive from Los Angeles, about an hour from east of Palm Springs, and it's 40 miles north of the Mexican border. And you can see The yellow line is the Mexican border and the Salton Sea is up there. So we started by investigating the environment of the site, which is dominated on the one hand by agriculture, but also by geothermal resource extraction industries. And at the same time, there are wildlife sanctuaries and nature reserves. We studied the inhabitants of the regions, their attractors, their settlement patterns, but we were also interested in temporary occupants, beachgoers, adventure tourists, etc. Now, the site is really unique in that it straddles the San Andreas Fault, which is the fault that runs through San Francisco up the California coast. And it's the tectonic boundary between the Pacific and North American continental plates, which is why that fault is always the big issue for earthquakes in the region. And it's this line of faults that brings the magma and from deep in the earth to within a mile of the ground. And that's, of course, what not just creates the geothermal field for the industries in the area, but is also responsible for all the hot springs and the tourists. Because on the one hand, it's acidic, bubbling mud holes and active volcanoes that fuel the geothermal plants. At the same time, it became a tourist attractor. Now, to understand the site, you also have to understand its hydrologic history. The Salton Sea was sustained by the Colorado River. And the Colorado River is a transboundary waterway. It extends across 7 US states, right? It's produced the Grand Canyon. It goes from the states into Mexico. It supports 40 million people, extensive agricultural lands, wildlife refuges, hydropower systems, etc. And prior to the construction of the dams, the aqueducts, the levees, the reservoirs that now regulate all the water flows in the West, it's an enormous infrastructure. The river used to alternate between flowing into the Imperial Valley and filling the Salton Sea. And then some years it diverted south towards Mexico and the Gulf of California. When the river inundated the valley, it produced a lake. It was called Lake Cahuilla. It was a vast water body that was 26 times the size of the Salton Sea. And it was named for the indigenous Native American community that inhabited the area. And when the river bypassed the valley, the basin reverted to a desert. You know, when we think of landscape, we always think of this thing as something that's static. And this oscillation, however, created this enormously dynamic landscape. As architects and urban designers and humans, we seem to hate the dynamism of landscape, so we always try to control it, right? And that's exactly what happened because the rivers, as it flows, it moves sediment, and the sediment deposition made the delta of the Imperial Valley incredibly agriculturally productive. And this, of course, prompted canal construction to maintain the flow of water. So in 1900, they built these 2 canals so that the water wouldn't oscillate and it would always flow into the Salton Sea. But 5 years after the canals were built, seasonal flooding breached one of the irrigation canals. It broke, and the water from the Colorado poured into the valley for 2 years uninterrupted and produced the largest lake in California, right? As a kind of accidental, what they called the accidental lake. This large lake then attracted a development, tourism in the 50s and 60s. This was how, you know, Palm Springs also emerges, right? Resorts, yacht clubs, condos, schools, the whole western coast became inland beach towns known as Bombay Beach, and other resort communities lined the shores. As California's largest lake, it attracted 1.5 million people each year, more than Yosemite National Park, including many celebrities, right? Marilyn Monroe, you guys probably don't know who these people are anymore, Frank Sinatra, the Beach Boys, etc. So it's a long story, but you'll understand why we took this on as a site. But then this story of incredible abundance, you know, beach towns, fertile plains, ended abruptly because of the political water wars in California, where the Colorado River was diverted north of the Salton Sea toward energy production and water for coastal cities. So basically, the water was diverted above the Salton Sea to bring water to LA and San Diego and also Palm Springs because they were growing cities built in a desert with not enough water. And of course, what happened is the Salton Sea, the water coming into the Salton Sea becomes now a trickle. And that water coming through from the Colorado would go through the agricultural fields before it would get to the Salton Sea. And of course, the pollution from industrial agricultural runoff basically polluted and salinated the sea over time, right? It's evaporating, it's getting more salty. And what happened? A massive die-off of fish and bird populations that were smelled in LA, 2 hours away, right? Huge environmental disaster. Since the late 1990s, many efforts have attempted to try to deal with this environmental disaster and the urban issues around the sea. And it was only recently that because of rising environmental concerns on the one hand, but also the potential of green technologies started to renew focus on the region when there was a soaring demand for lithium to support EV development. And this reframed the Salton Sea as a major geothermal extraction zone because they discovered that this mineral-rich brine that was once considered waste from the geothermal plants is one of the largest lithium sources, right, for EV energy to meet up to 40% of global demand while producing geothermal energy, drawing billions in investment now to one of California's poorest counties. So these were the diverse conditions that we started with that were all related to the history of the site, that what set the stage for its analysis and for our studio. So of course, because hydrology was so important, was critical to understanding the site, we started as similar to the other studios, these were all based on teams of 2 or 3 students. They studied the Colorado River Basin, trying to map its watershed over time and across scales, as well as investigating the impacts of the dynamic of the river and what it had on the changing size of the Salton Sea over time. They also tried to understand the kind of hydrological infrastructure. There is no kind of natural river here anymore, right? It's dams, levees, aqueducts, canals, water power stations that control the movement of the river, as well as understanding the changing elevation of the river. So this was a section that's basically drawn from the top of the Colorado River all the way down to the Salton Sea so that you understand it sort of in section. And it was also a datascape showing the amount, and at the bottom were the images of the various hydro power stations, dams, and it was also a datascape that showed the quantity of water as it changed, right, by the time it got to the sea. And these different scales and types of analysis also focused on the specific hydrology and watershed of the territory around the Salton Sea. So we're moving at enormous scales, you know, from the entire Colorado River basin to our site, and dealing with things like the topography and landscape of the sea itself and what's happening along the perimeter over time. Because it was also critical for us to understand through drawing the geological material conditions of the landscape. You know, as architects, we often think about site as a surface, right? There's no material thickness to this stuff, or we draw it in black because it's all the same. But of course, for us to understand the geology of what was below that surface was critical. So this included mapping the Salton Buttes, the volcanoes, the mud holes, as well as the the geothermal field that sits below the San Andreas Fault that runs through the site. And this formed the basis of analyzing also tourist activities related to the presence of hot springs. We also looked at the productive capacity of the geothermal industry. And the large sections that you see on the right-hand side are showing geological data that are key to understanding the site in terms of its relationship to material extraction industries. And here the sections are overlaid with the plan, again, of that segment, so that we could understand them together, the satellite imagery, as well as the data below, which shows us what the different minerals were. On the left, you're seeing the mineral composition at each of the geothermal wells that are shown again on the map. So we're using many different ways of drawing this. The analysis also included the energy productivity of the industries present on the site, which you see on the upper left-hand corner, and their relationship to statewide, national, and global production. We wanted to understand how important this place was. Another category of site analysis included the relationship between cultural history and urban morphology. And in this, we looked at very different temporal scales to understand both the very deep history, the Native American, indigenous history of the site, the resort and recreational tourism of the 1960s that led to the development of the towns, and methods of drawing, included both more typical modes of mapping the urban morphology in different ways for the 6 cities. This sort of shows 3 of them, but also showing what were the kind of strange attractors through collages and photographs of these places. And in the sea, you can also understand the cities are linked by a road that moves around the lake. A key piece of the site analysis focused on the natural ecosystems, wildlife attractors, wildlife sanctuaries, and also the specific threats to these ecologies. So we did extensive research on soil systems, on agriculture. The drawing on the left maps the different crops being produced in the region, as well as their economies, to understand the logistics and spatialization of agricultural territories supported by the watershed. The image on the bottom was a kind of timeline mapping the history, but pulling kind of key photographs. And because this was a stopover route for migrant birds, one of the students did a migration mapping on the upper right, which was understanding what species are moving across the site. And because we were also trying to really understand the resource extraction landscape and new technologies like solar and wind, this was also something studied by the students and, included understanding it as a system, but also understanding what are the logistics of production of these industries. We often work with programs that we don't necessarily know a lot about, so trying to understand what this meant in architectural terms was important. And I'm going to show you just a kind of quick sampling of projects that were generated from the studio. This project was called Seawater Cyborg. It was a direct response to the depth of analysis of the site in relation to agriculture and hydrology, because it was focusing on a kind of regenerative and diverse agricultural program that would be based on saline, salt water, rather than fresh water, to deal with freshwater scarcity, which is an issue globally. 70% of our freshwater resources go to agriculture, right? So how we deal with this. But it was also about dealing with water toxicity, biodiversity, and environmental remediation. The students that were looking at the San Andreas Fault, the mud holes and volcanoes, they developed a project called the Geo-Eco Nexus that was about amplifying regional geothermal and clean energy production and using tourism, using their project to increase tourism by developing a spa hotel and retreat community, a wildlife sanctuary, and ecotourism facilities to support urban development in the region. And here also the methods of drawing their final project were drawn from the ways in which they were thinking about representation in their earlier site analysis. And the final sample project I'm going to show, which was called Island Urbanism, was a territorial strategy to deal with a diffuse desert landscape, like diffuse urbanism, when you've got a series of small towns scattered, right? And what they did was they developed this series of bands, and each of these are showing these sort of strips. Up on the far left, you can see a kind of map. They took what was the northern part of the sea, and they linked what were, what was a rail line, a canal, a roadway, the towns, and they linked the canal to the beach with these bands. So they concentrated development in these bands, and they tried to couple agriculture, energy generating and recreational landscapes with urban programming, but in a way to sort of think it through transit and mobility. So understanding and drawing the site was something that was so pervasive in the studio, it went all the way through from the analytical phases to the project's development. Yeah.
So, these guys.
I have a class.
They have other, some of them have other things to do. So I want to open it up for questions a little
Okay.
bit. So, sorry, I wanted to
That's
see
fine.
this. You're gonna have to show me some other time.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for sharing the research work that you guys have done, and some pretty amazing drawings. Most of those drawings, by the way, are grad student drawings. So the Vienna was a mixed.
Vienna was mixed. It was 2/3 undergrad, 1/3 grad. So 4th year undergrad.
Yep.
And 3rd year grad.
Yeah. And I thought that it was important for people to see what's going on someplace else, a different university, and understand that this is the level of thinking that's happening down at the University of Virginia, and sharing the graphics and the sort of quality of thinking that goes into creating that level of graphics. Now, our projects in the 302 studio, much simpler, thank goodness. But again, I wanted everybody to get a chance to see that sort of stuff. So let's open it up to questions. If anyone has any, raise your hand. Go ahead.
I think in the New York and Vienna projects, the return sites.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Super interesting. What was the purpose of having 3 sites for one studio?
I mean, it was a research studio, so our students usually have then the opportunity to identify a little bit their own agendas. And the northern side was more about a master plan on an agricultural field, where students were really struggling with occupying a green field and how agricultural function can still be incorporated into housing. So that was a little bit the focus of the northern side. The southern one, the middle one was challenging the formal master plan of Aspen, because, I remember the time when the competition was launched, we all felt they were just repeating what they had in the inner city.
They were
And
doing a sort of circle around
the
the
circle
lake,
around
right?
the lake.
Instead of circle around the cathedral or
So
something.
challenging this strategy, students wanted to take on, because, I don't, maybe you remember the one with the huge bands that was all about bringing the forest in and to really allow this neighborhood to be more infused with open space. And the last one was this factory. That was all about adaptive reuse and what can you do with a gigantic warehouse.
We should also note that that the Aspern one, half of it had been built and the other half was going to be built but hadn't been built yet. So we thought, oh, that's a great opportunity. And we said to the students, you can build within the existing master plan, or you can do whatever you want, right? You can challenge it. And so we often do more than one site when it's a large group, because, so that we have comparisons. You want to be able to see both different teams taking on, or different students taking on the same site, but in different ways, and to see what the different sites might produce, right?
Even in all New York studios, we always have giving students choices, either 3 sites that are close to each other and need to start communicate through the urban scale, or in 1 year we were taking over all the public school sites because it was a public-private partnership that the city at this time developed to bring in private development on these sites and to couple it with housing because they didn't have enough funds to renovate the schools. So students picked their own neighborhood, and that was actually super exciting. Everyone is excited about what the partner is doing because we're working on different sites.
The other thing that both in all of the New York studios and when we're coordinating them, you know, this is about 50 students, you know, so 4 different studios, but all working on them. So that's also why we had the different sites. But we were always taking on real projects, right? The school was a real project going on. The Brooklyn Navy Yards was a real project, you know, that was happening. The only difference was they weren't going to put housing there. We said, why not, you know? But because they were doing it through creative manufacturing. Yeah. We can all point at different people.
Graduate programs while asking for students to be working within kind of the graduate consistency.
I mean, they learn a wide range, right? So they're working in Rhino and AutoCAD, all of Adobe Suite, you know, Illustrator, Photoshop. And we always tell them to just use, and to hybridize programs, to not work with a single program, but to work with the program that's going to be effective for what it is that you're doing, right? So that if you're working with images, you might be using Photoshop. If you're modeling, you're working in Rhino, but when you're bringing it into presentation mode, you might be moving it from there into Illustrator, you know, to get line weights, etc.
I mean, the urban analysis usually starts with a GIS workshop because
Yeah.
it's a really good data source. You can import the data or export it into Illustrator. And consistency, there's a lot of feedback that students are getting, but we also usually either give them a color palette when we want to produce the atlas and it becomes a shared resource.
We did that.
Or they produce their color palette themselves. But we always give them, there's this website where you can just move around and it gives you the perfect color. So
yeah.
Also restate the question.
Oh, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
that question was about
Are we getting
graphic consistency and software programs.
Yeah.
PJ.
Wow. Design portion of your presentation, which unfortunately we didn't get to.
We're going to show it really quickly here in the background. Yeah.
Yes, I can give an elevator pitch, and Isla can slide.
I'll just go.
Isla's going through the slides.
Yeah.
So Tim Beatley and JD Brown founded the Biophilic Cities Network 2018, I think, or 13. So it's 10 years ago. So it was 13. And the Biophilic Cities Network has now 36 cities who all committed to sustainable development. Biophilic is not only sustainable, it actually talks about our affiliation to be connected to nature, and it has a series of principles. And many cities internationally now joined the network, and Arlington, DC is also a member city. I'm also on a natural heritage committee in my other time that I don't teach and work. And at some point, my colleagues on this committee asked me, why is Charlottesville not a part of the network? And I couldn't answer it. I said, I'm going to invite Tim. He's going to give a presentation. Presentation was amazing. Momentum developed in the county of Albemarle County and the city of Charlottesville, and a group of us decided we're going to move this forward. We're going to move that mountain that Charlottesville and the county are joining, and that was my pitch. We are going to create the first biophilic region because biosheds work different than administrative boundaries. So that was 3 things coming together: activism on a political level, working all the things in the background. Then I launched my seminar. I dedicated the topic to the biophilic region. My students analyzed and created again a beautiful atlas of 7 assets I also asked them to improve the assets from water management to land preservation, etc. And architectural scale is sustainable development. We have now the whole catalog of LEED certified buildings in the region. And I invited all the community members to the final presentation, and they were super thrilled about the work and said, you need to bring this to the city council and you have to present it. So I got a grant from the Jefferson Trust. I designed this exhibition with 3 grad students, and it was a beautiful moment because at this second, we discovered that a lot of us work on these topics. So a total of 15 faculty actually joined later on in the exhibition, from material research to tactical, biophilic strategies, illustration, biophilic building blocks. All of these lectures are, by the way, online on our YouTube channel. We recorded them so you can watch them, including the opening ceremony. And if you go to the opening ceremony, that is, next one.
Yeah.
That is when the city by then applied and they got their certificate, and the county application is in the pipeline, and I applied for another larger grant. So we hope that all of this moves towards an exciting biophilic future.
Let's do one more question.
Yes.
A request, if you wouldn't mind, giving, my colleague David the link to the lecture.
Yeah.
That would be great and distribute it. Because
Yeah.
I was also interested in this.
We can share the PDF if you want, of the images, et cetera. Yeah.
That would be good, but also of the.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
link
I can
to
forward
the-
that. Yeah.
This.
Yeah. Great. Well,
Okay,
thank you very
Thank you,
much.
and thanks so much.
Yeah.
Next it is, so it'll be back in this studio over here. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
You knew you'd get it in, so.
Oh, don't worry. You can just, oh, sorry, I realized I unhooked